Elise never wore a uniform, never carried a weapon, and had no military rank. But she was there, in the heart of Camp Valor, a base in the Afghan desert. Her role wasn't to fight or to strategize in combat. Instead, she worked in the kitchen, preparing meals for the soldiers who came and went, men who were often hardened by the brutal realities of war. To them, she wasn't just the cook. She was a presence, someone who cared enough to make a meal feel like more than just a moment of sustenance. Her touch brought a sense of home, a reminder that humanity still existed amidst the chaos of war. But Elise's story didn't start here, in the dusty kitchens of a distant desert. It began far away, in a quiet Boston kitchen where she learned the power of love through food. Her brother, Micah, a Marine, had always been her rock. He was fearless, funny, and the kind of person who could brighten any room with a single laugh. But war changed him, as it changed so many others. Micah's tours were long, and after each one, he came back a little different. And then, one day, they sent home a box wrapped in the American flag, his life forever lost to an IED in Afghanistan. Elise had begged him not to go back, to let it be the last time. But Micah had been driven by duty, and that was something Elise couldn't change. His death left her with a searing guilt. She blamed the system, the cold chain of command that saw soldiers as numbers. But instead of letting grief paralyze her, Elise found a way to channel it. She couldn't stop the war, but she could protect the souls caught in it. She enrolled as a civilian cook for the military, and though her only tools were spices and a ladle, she was determined to do what she could for those who had to endure the same horrors her brother had faced. At Camp Valor, Elise quickly earned a reputation. The soldiers joked that she made the best meals in the Middle East, but they knew it was about more than just the food. She saw them, not just as soldiers, but as human beings. She knew the toll war took on the body and mind, and when others barked orders, she listened. Elise had a way of reminding them that they were still people, not machines. She served them with empathy, a rare gift in a world where emotions were often buried beneath the weight of the uniform. Her role wasn't glorious, but in the quiet moments, when the mess hall emptied and the soldiers sat down to their meals, it was clear that Elise had become something far more than just the cook. She had become a protector of sorts, someone who offered solace in the form of a hot meal and a kind word. The soldiers didn't just eat her food, they sought out her presence, even if just for a moment. To them, Elise represented a small glimmer of kindness in a world that often seemed devoid of it. The desert sun blazed outside, but inside the kitchen, Elise worked tirelessly. She was the unsung hero, the one who saw them when no one else did, and in return, she received their respect, their trust, and a quiet bond that transcended rank and uniform. In a place where military orders and discipline ruled, Elise stood out, not because of her authority, but because of her ability to connect. In a place designed to break people down, she built them up. That was her mission, and she carried it out with quiet strength. Elise wasn't just feeding soldiers. She was feeding their souls, helping them hold on to the parts of themselves that war threatened to take away. In a world filled with generals and sergeants, she had become a symbol of something far more enduring humanity. The mess hall at Camp Valor was buzzing as usual, the clattering of trays and the hum of quiet conversations filling the air. But today, something felt different. Private Diaz, a young soldier with a black eye and bruised lips, shuffled into the room, his hands trembling as he stood in line for his meal. He had been through hell physically and mentally. The soldiers at the base knew that, even if no one talked about it openly. Diaz had been hazed by a superior officer. He didn't speak much of it, but the signs were there. He was broken, beaten down not just by the physical toll of war, but by the mental strain of being pushed to the breaking point by his own brothers in arms. Elise watched from the kitchen as Diaz approached the serving counter. His face was pale, his eyes dull from exhaustion. The usual banter from the soldiers was gone. Today, the air felt thick with something else: sympathy. Maybe, but also discomfort. No one said anything. No one moved. Elise met his eyes for just a moment, and in that moment, she knew. She knew that Diaz wasn't just hurt. He was broken, in ways no one could fix with a simple meal. But maybe, just maybe, she could offer him something more, something that mattered. As Elise prepared the food, General Dalton walked in, his boots clanging against the floor with authority. His presence alone had a way of silencing the room. He was a man of power, someone whose very name commanded respect and fear. He walked straight up to the serving counter and locked eyes with Elise. There was no warmth in his gaze, only cold command. "Private Diaz is on report," Dalton snapped, his voice sharp like the crack of a rifle. "No meal privileges for him today. Deny him his food." Elise felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders like a heavy stone. She looked at Diaz, who stood there barely holding himself together, as if he had already been torn apart. Her heart ached, but she knew what she had to do. She could follow the order, do what was expected of her, and stay out of trouble. But then she would have to live with herself. The kitchen went silent. Elise stood frozen for a long moment, the tray in her hands almost too heavy to hold. She looked at Dalton, then back at Diaz, who was barely holding himself together. The decision was clear, but it wasn't easy. She could feel her pulse quicken, a storm of emotions swirling inside her. The tension in the room grew unbearable. Everyone watching, waiting. This wasn't just about food anymore. It was about something bigger, about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. The words came out of her mouth before she could stop them. "I feed the hungry, not the obedient." It wasn't a shout, but it felt like a declaration that ripped through the air, as bold and defiant as any command. The room seemed to hold its breath. No one moved. No one spoke. For a moment, Elise thought she might have crossed a line that could never be undone, but there was no turning back now. Dalton's face reddened in fury. He stepped forward, his fist clenched, but Elise stood her ground, refusing to flinch. The soldiers in the room seemed to hold their collective breath, unsure of what was going to happen next. Finally, Dalton barked his order, his voice full of disgust. "You're done here. Pack your things. By sundown. You're off this base." Elise didn't argue. She didn't try to justify her actions. She simply nodded, turned, and handed the tray of food to Diaz. For a brief moment, their hands touched. And in that moment, Elise understood something she hadn't before. This was about more than just a meal. It was about dignity, compassion, and the strength to stand up when everything around you tells you to fall in line. As she watched Diaz walk away, holding his plate, a strange sense of peace washed over her. She had done the right thing. The rest of the soldiers in the room, those who had witnessed the quiet defiance, remained silent. But they didn't need to say anything. The act of defiance, the courage it took, spoke louder than any words ever could. In the silence that followed, Elise began to pack up her things, preparing to leave the base as Dalton had ordered. But her heart felt lighter than it had in days. The path she had chosen wasn't the easy one, but it was the only one she could take. And now, as the desert sun beat down on her, She was ready to face whatever came next. The tension in the mess hall felt like a physical weight, pressing down on everyone. Elise stood there, tray in hand, as Diaz took his plate, his hands still trembling slightly from the earlier confrontation. The room seemed to hold its breath as General Dalton's face turned from a deep red to an almost purple shade of rage. His words cut through the air, demanding obedience, but Elise didn't flinch. She had made her choice. She wouldn't stand by and watch as Diaz, broken by both war and his own comrades, was punished for things beyond his control. With a steady hand, Elise placed the tray in Diaz's shaking hands. His eyes met hers, full of gratitude but also filled with shame. It wasn't just the food that she had given him. It was something more. In that small act of defiance, Elise had offered him a lifeline. The simple act of feeding him was a rebellion, a refusal to participate in the system that treated soldiers like pawns. She had no power in this place, no rank to back her up. Yet, in that moment, she had something far more important: the courage to do what she knew was right. General Dalton moved quickly, his boots clicking on the concrete floor as he approached with purpose. His voice was filled with venom as he bellowed at her. "You've just sealed your fate, woman," he said, his words dripping with contempt. He wasn't accustomed to insubordination. "You will leave this base by sundown. Pack your things. Now." The words hit Elise like a punch to the gut. She knew it was coming. There was no way to avoid the fallout of defying an order, especially one so direct. But as the weight of Dalton's words sank in, she felt a calmness wash over her. It was the same calmness she had felt when she first made the choice to feed Diaz. She wasn't afraid anymore. In fact, she felt lighter than she had in years. The only thing left to do was leave. Elise didn't argue. She didn't try to justify herself. She simply nodded and began to gather her belongings. The mess hall had fallen silent, the soldiers watching her closely. Some looked away, too uncomfortable to make eye contact. Others stood frozen, as if they weren't sure how to process what had just happened. But Elise's heart remained steady. She had done what was right, and now she would face whatever consequences came her way. As she packed her duffel bag, one of the soldiers, Private Diaz, approached her. His face was a mixture of gratitude and guilt. He opened his mouth to speak, but words failed him. Elise simply looked at him and gave a small, reassuring smile. She could see that he wanted to say something, perhaps to apologize, but there was no need. The bond between them had already been formed in the briefest of moments, and no words were necessary. He silently handed her a piece of bread, his own small way of showing respect and thanks. Elise took it, her fingers brushing his for a moment. That simple, fleeting connection spoke volumes. One by one, soldiers began to trickle over to her, offering their own gestures of respect. Sergeant Patel, a battle-hardened man who had seen too much to show emotion, placed a canteen on her duffel bag with a soft grunt. Corporal Clark, who had always kept to himself, handed her a spare sleeping roll. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was their way of saying thank you. It was their way of showing that they understood, even if they couldn't say it aloud. Elise's eyes flickered between them, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she wasn't alone. Despite the immense pressure and isolation she had felt since arriving at Camp Valor, here, now, in this moment, she felt a sense of belonging. The room remained silent as Elise stood there, her duffel bag packed and ready to go. The walls of the mess hall seemed to close in on her, yet she stood tall. The decision to leave wasn't easy. It was a loss. But it was also a moment of pride, a quiet victory that would stay with her long after she was gone. The soldiers, too, felt that quiet victory, though they couldn't fully understand it. They didn't know how to express the respect they now felt for her. But their silence, their actions, said more than words ever could. As Elise made her way toward the exit, her eyes caught Sergeant Miller's. He had always been the stoic, no-nonsense type, a man who commanded respect without needing to raise his voice. Now, he stood a few feet away, watching her with something different in his eyes, something like reverence. He didn't salute her. There were no formalities. But his gaze held a deep respect, the kind that can only come from understanding. In a world that valued power and rank, Elise had just proven that true leadership wasn't about authority. It was about doing what was right, no matter the cost. With a final glance around the mess hall, Elise stepped outside, the heat of the desert sun hitting her face. The soldiers inside might have seen her as just a cook, but in that moment, she had become something more. She had become a symbol of courage in a place where courage was often in short supply. And as she walked away, there was a sense of finality to it, a recognition that she had made her stand. And now it was time to face the consequences. Yet, in the quiet of the desert, Elise didn't feel fear. She felt something else, something like peace. It was the peace of knowing she had stayed true to herself, no matter what anyone else thought. It was the peace of knowing she had made a difference, even if only in the lives of a few soldiers who would never forget what she had done. The days after Elise's defiance were quiet, but they carried a weight that no one could ignore. Camp Valor had always been a place where rules were absolute, where soldiers followed orders without question. But now, everything felt different. Elise had done something that none of the soldiers expected, something that resonated deeper than any official order or military code. Her refusal to follow General Dalton's directive, her stand for what was right, had changed the fabric of this place in a way no one could have anticipated. In the days that followed, the men and women of the base began to show their respect for Elise in ways that went far beyond the simple gratitude of a soldier receiving a meal. Private Diaz was the first to approach her after the incident. He had always been a quiet, reserved young man, but now, with a sense of quiet dignity, he handed her a small bundle. It wasn't much a canteen, a bag of dried fruit, and a few extra packets of biscuits. But to Elise, it meant everything. It wasn't just a gesture of thanks, it was an acknowledgement, an understanding that what she had done wasn't just about food. It was about preserving their humanity in a place that too often stripped it away. One by one, other soldiers came to her with small acts of kindness. Sergeant Patel, who had always been quick to bark orders but never showed much warmth, handed her a canteen and quietly nodded in respect. Corporal Clark, a man of few words, offered her a spare sleeping roll, a gesture that spoke volumes. Elise didn't ask for these things, didn't expect them, but they kept coming tokens of respect, symbols of solidarity. These were the same soldiers who had once seen her only as the cook, as the woman who made meals. Now, they saw her as something more, a leader, a symbol of courage, someone who had given them something they had all lost hope. Sergeant Miller, who had always carried the weight of his experience like armor, was the last to approach Elise. He had never been the type to show much emotion, always focused on the mission, on discipline. But what Elise had done had shaken him in a way he hadn't anticipated. He had followed orders all his life, never once questioning the system, never once standing up to the injustices that often plagued the ranks. Elise, however, had done just that. And in doing so, she had shown him something he hadn't seen before true leadership. Miller stood in front of her, looking at her with a new sense of respect, something he had never offered anyone before. He had always respected authority, the clear lines of command that defined everything in the military. But Elise had changed that. She had broken the mold, showing that leadership wasn't just about following orders, it was about standing up for what was right, even when it meant going against the grain. "You did what none of us had the guts to do," he said, his voice steady but full of meaning. "You reminded us what it really means to be a leader, not because of rank, but because of courage." Elise smiled faintly, her heart heavy with the realization that she had changed something within him, within all of them. She hadn't expected this recognition. She had never wanted it. But now, as she stood there, receiving it from Miller, she understood that what she had done had transcended the role she had played in their lives. She wasn't just a cook anymore. She was a symbol of resistance, of compassion, and of the power of standing up for what's right. The next morning, as the sun rose over the dusty horizon, the camp commander arrived. She was a woman with silver hair, a no-nonsense demeanor, and a sharp eye that missed nothing. Elise had always respected her, though they had never been close. The commander had seen something in her from the beginning, something that made her different from the other civilians on the base. Now, she came to deliver an unexpected message. "General Dalton has been recalled," the commander said, her voice calm but firm. "You will not be leaving the base. You'll continue your work here, and you will be doing so in an official capacity. The men here respect you, Elise. They've shown me that." Elise stood still for a moment, absorbing the news. It wasn't just about the fact that Dalton had been removed from his post. It was about the fact that her actions, her refusal to obey an unjust order, had led to this. She had fought for what was right, and now the consequences were playing out in a way that she never could have expected. She wasn't just being allowed to stay at the base. She was being welcomed back in a way that acknowledged her worth, not just as a cook, but as a leader. The soldiers who had witnessed her act of defiance, who had seen her stand up against the powerful forces of the military system, were now rallying behind her in ways that went beyond mere words. They had seen in her the kind of strength and courage that few men could ever hope to possess. They had seen someone who was willing to sacrifice her own place, her own safety, for the sake of doing what was right. Elise returned to the mess hall, the sounds of the soldiers at work continuing as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. She had become something she had never expected to be: a leader, a force for change in a world that often seemed defined by rules and regulations, where doing what was right came second to following orders. As the days passed, the soldiers began to look at her differently. No longer just the woman who cooked their meals, she had become something far more important, someone who stood for the values they had all signed up to defend, but who often found themselves questioning in the face of war. They saw in her a reminder that leadership wasn't just about power, authority, or medals. It was about doing the right thing, even when no one else would. Elise's presence at Camp Valor became a quiet force of change. Soldiers started to approach her, not just for food, but for guidance, for reassurance. She had become a voice of reason in a place where chaos often reigned. And in the stillness of those quiet moments, she understood something: her legacy wasn't about the title she carried, but the way she had impacted the lives of those around her. She had become a legend, not because she had worn a uniform, not because she had the authority of a commanding officer, but because she had the courage to stand up when no one else did. She had reminded them all that true leadership comes from within, from the strength of one's convictions, and from the willingness to fight for what is right. Elise had shown them that you don't need a rank to be a leader. You just need to be human. Elise continued her work at Camp Valor day after day, serving the soldiers with the same quiet dedication she always had. But now, something had changed. Though she still wore the same apron and served meals in the same kitchen, her role had shifted in the eyes of everyone around her. She wasn't just a cook anymore. She had become a symbol, a living testament to the power of standing up for what is right. The soldiers, once merely grateful for her meals, now saw her as a leader without rank, without medals, without anything that the military typically values. But they knew better than anyone else. What made a true leader wasn't what they wore, or the titles they held. It was the courage to act when it mattered most. Elise never sought the recognition that had come her way. She wasn't the type to chase glory or to stand at the front of a crowd. But in the weeks that followed the incident with General Dalton, she felt the shift every time a soldier stopped to speak with her. The same men who had once ignored her, who had only seen her as someone who fed them, now approached her with respect. Private Diaz was one of the first to greet her in the mornings, often bringing a fresh cup of coffee with a smile. He had been through so much, but now he seemed lighter, his burdens lifted in part by the simple act of kindness Elise had shown him. It wasn't just food that she had given him. It was dignity, something he had nearly lost. The other soldiers followed suit, offering their thanks in the form of small gestures, canteens, extra blankets, even a homemade knife. It wasn't much, but to Elise, it meant everything. These were the same men who had once seen her as just a civilian, a woman outside the ranks, someone who had no real place in their world. Now, they saw her for who she truly was, someone who had the courage to defy an unjust order, someone who reminded them of the humanity that they had lost on the battlefield. Elise had shown them that leadership wasn't about commands or uniforms. It was about compassion, courage, and the willingness to do what was right, even when it seemed like the whole world was against you. Sergeant Miller, who had once stood as a symbol of military discipline and unwavering authority, now looked at Elise with something new, something close to admiration. He had never been one to show weakness, never one to openly acknowledge the flaws of the military system. But Elise had opened his eyes to something he had never considered. True leadership was about standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. One afternoon, as Elise worked at the stove, Miller approached her with a quiet nod. No words were exchanged at first, just a look of mutual understanding. And in that moment, Elise knew that her actions had not only impacted the soldiers, but had also changed Miller in a way he would never fully express. There was no need to his respect for her was clear, written in the small, everyday moments they shared from then on. The base had become a different place, a place where, despite the rigid structure and the chains of command, humanity had found its place. Soldiers began to talk more openly with Elise, not just about their struggles, but about their hopes, their fears, and the things they had learned through war. Some of them, like Diaz, opened up about their families, their lives before they put on the uniform. Elise listened, always. She had become a quiet confidant to many of them, someone who saw them as more than just soldiers. She saw them as people. As the days passed, the whispers of Elise's courage spread beyond the base. The stories of the woman who had defied a general to feed a broken soldier made their way through the military community. Elise had done something that few others dared to do. She had stood up for what was right, regardless of the cost. She had put the lives and dignity of the soldiers before anything else, even her own safety. Her legacy wasn't written in the form of medals or official accolades. It was written in the respect she had earned from the soldiers around her, a respect that would last long after her time at Camp Valor ended. One day, the camp commander approached Elise with a proposal. The commander, who had been one of the few who had seen Elise's true worth from the beginning, offered her a position that would allow her to continue her work at the base, this time in a more official capacity. Elise hesitated at first. She had never sought a promotion or recognition. She had simply wanted to do what was right. But when she saw the look of respect in the commander's eyes, she realized that this wasn't about rank or power. It was about continuing her mission. She had changed the lives of so many soldiers, and now, in a small way, she had the chance to do it on a larger scale. As Elise accepted the offer, she realized that her time at Camp Valor had been more than just a job. It had been a calling. She had become a leader in the truest sense of the word. Not because of the uniform she wore, but because of the strength of her convictions and the depth of her compassion. The soldiers respected her not because they had to, but because they saw the same qualities in her that they valued in themselves. It was a legacy of leadership that would live on long after she left the base, a reminder that even in the harshest of environments, there was always room for humanity. Elise's legacy wasn't one of military conquest or strategic brilliance. It was a legacy of quiet, unwavering strength. It was a legacy of doing what was right, even when it meant going against the grain. And, perhaps most importantly, it was a legacy of compassion, of reminding people that the most powerful weapon a person could carry was the ability to show kindness in a world that often seemed devoid of it. Elise had become a legend, not because she sought glory, but because she simply chose to be human, even when the world around her demanded something else.